Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to wrap up our unit on the Puritans by talking about the decline of Denham. What happened in Denham is what seems to happen invariably with all attempts at arriving at a perfect society. It failed. To this point, nobody's pulled it off yet. However, when we talk about decline with the Puritans and the way Lockridge talks about this decline, it wasn't a decline in terms of society falling apart, chaos, warfare, disease, famine, these types of things. What really declined in Denham was the utopian spirit that the town was originally established to bring about. That's what declined, this utopian spirit. Denham remained a rather conservative, Christian, growing community. So by the normal sense that people like historians would consider, Denham didn't decline, Denham didn't fail, but by the Puritans' own standards, the standard that they set out for themselves to create this ideal godly community. They themselves considered themselves a failure. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. In what ways did they actually fail themselves? Some of these things we talked about already and we're going to elaborate on, and some of them are going to be new things that we're going to consider. The first one we already did talk about, and that's the breakdown of the communal ideal. The best example of this is when people decided to no longer, live in the village, consolidate their farmland, and live more in isolation. We said the Puritans initially did not like the idea of people living in isolation. You needed to live in a group together so that you could watch each other and help each other and encourage each other to stay on a godly path. But as time went on, some Puritans chose convenience and ease of life over these earlier priorities. And so think of that desire to move away from the village and the consolidation of land as one of these signs of failure. The Puritans themselves recognized this as they saw it happen. Some people were apathetic to it. Some people participated in this moving away, but others noticed that this is bad. This is not the way we originally intended to live. The covenant falls into disuse as time goes on. Lockridge tells us in 1660, people, just strangers, unapproved, started to move to Denham, started to acquire land, started to intermarry with people from Denham. That was not the way it was originally supposed to work. People coming to the community needed to be scrutinized. The first two clauses in the covenant were the only people that could live here are Christians, and if you weren't a Christian, you had to go somewhere else. And to make sure that happened, there were laws prohibiting outsiders from simply coming to live in Denham and acquiring land. But as early as 1660, that was being ignored. People were just moving in. By 1675, the law against strangers coming to visit, even to come into the town of Denham, just to visit, you had to be approved. Lockridge tells us by 1675 that was being ignored. Eventually, the requirement that people sign the covenant when they moved to Denham was being ignored. Lockridge could document this in the book. You could see the original covenant, and there were names of newcomers coming, and then at a certain point, the signatures stopped. They stopped enforcing the covenant. And why this is so important, Lockridge tells us, is that the covenant was the blueprint of utopian aspiration in Denham. This is where they set their social ideals down in writing. This was the foundation of their utopian vision. And by the late 1600s, the covenant was just being ignored and no longer being followed. Let's talk about declining church membership and the creation of the halfway covenant. Now, we already talked about the problematic nature of the decision about church membership in Denham. We said initially one of the options that was being considered for church membership was that everybody who was a member of the town could potentially become a member of the church. And we said they decided against that because they were really worried about the purity of the church. And so they wanted to add an extra layer of security when it came to church membership. And so it was decided that to become a member of the church, one had to be viewed as a visible saint, as one of those elect that the people in Denham believed was going to heaven. All right, so the status of visible saint was the criteria for church membership. We said in the beginning, 80% of the people in the town, men and women, were accepted as members of the church. And the hope was, as time went on, that percentage would increase. As the town followed the will of God, as the town became more stable, more and more people would be accepted as members of the church. However, just the opposite happened. Church membership declined. 80% was the high water mark, and it started to decline after that. This continued through the 1600s in Denham and became such a problem that in the early 1660s, Denham and some other towns started to collaborate to try and figure out a way to deal with this problem of declining membership. Again, I keep reminding you of this. Denham was a typical town. The kinds of things that tended to happen in Denham were also happening in other towns. And so many other Puritan towns were also experiencing this decline in church membership. So in 1662, the Puritans organized, particularly their ministers were the people that organized this. The ministers of various Puritan towns in Massachusetts created a synod. A synod is a meeting of church leaders to discuss policy. Now, every church in Massachusetts was independent. They could make their own decisions for their church. So this synod of 1662, resolutions that they created in the Synod of 1662 were not binding on any of the churches. They were recommendations. They were recommendations that could be followed or ignored as individual churches saw fit. Right? And so after coming together, discussing, praying, scouring the Bible, those people that met at this Synod of 1662 came up with what came to be known as the Halfway Covenant. The Halfway Covenant was a new criteria for church membership. What the Halfway Covenant afforded was that the children of church members, if your parent, one or both, it didn't have to be both your parents, it could just be one of your parents, was a member of the church, you, the child, was also granted church membership, with a couple slight restrictions. You weren't allowed to participate in communion or baptism. But other than that, you were a member of the church. Now, you could still become a member of the church the old way. If you believed yourself to be a visible saint, if you felt like you had gone through those stages of conversion, you could apply for full membership. And then you would get to participate in communion and baptism. But if you had not gone through those stages of conversion, you could now become a member of the church under this halfway covenant. That was the recommendation of the Synod of 1662. Now, once again, very important, none of the churches were obligated to accept this. It was just a recommendation. Your church could follow it or not follow it. Denham, in fact, did not initially follow the recommendations of the Synod of 1662. Let's face it, the Halfway Covenant was a compromise. And initially, the Puritans in Denham were not willing to go along with this compromise. And so they stuck to the old way of requiring a member of the church to be a visible saint. However, church membership continued to decline in Denham, decade after decade. It got so bad that by the 1690s, membership was so low in the church, they couldn't find a minister to serve in their church. For 5 years, Denham couldn't find a minister to serve. Why? They couldn't afford to pay a minister. Ministers need to eat. Ministers need to have clothing on their back. Ministers need to have time to read scripture and to minister and pray with members of the community. The idea of a Puritan minister wasn't that it was like a part-time job and you'd be out farming and then every Sunday come in and serve. No, it was a job. It was a full-time job. And therefore, Denham was having a hard time finding anybody that wanted to take this. Remember, the only people that were obligated to pay for the minister were members of the church. And with membership so low, they just couldn't offer very much money for a minister. It was ultimately this factor that led the people of Denham to accept the Halfway Covenant in the 1690s. Remember that the Synod was originally 1662. We're talking about 30 years later that they finally accepted it. And they did it because they felt as if they had two bad options. They were both bad. One of them was to do nothing and to continue to see declining church membership. The other was to raise church membership, to allow the children of church members, which would have significantly increased church membership, but nonetheless be a compromise from the original expectations of purity in the church. There was no perfect answer. There was no answer that was going to make everybody happy. But ultimately, the Puritans in Denham decided to go along with the halfway covenant by the 1690s, just so they could have a minister, so that their fellowship could continue. But everybody recognized this was something of a compromise. This was something of a decline from the earlier utopian vision. Let's talk about the death and retirement of the first generation. This was a really important factor. Lockridge pays significant attention to this. That first generation was really admired and revered by the second, the third, the fourth generation. It was that first generation that had, in some cases, suffered persecution for their religious beliefs back in England, that had decided to leave their home, to leave family, to leave friends, to cross an ocean, to create a community in Massachusetts, who built the town, who built the church, who created the institutions. What did that second or third or fourth generation do? They weren't persecuted in England. They didn't leave their family and friends. They didn't cross the ocean. They didn't create the town. They didn't create the church. And so when that second and third, that fourth generation looked back upon that first generation, they were often in awe at what that first generation had done, their sacrifices, their commitment. And that second and that third, that fourth generation, when they compared themselves to the first generation, often felt unworthy. This explains why church membership was declining. Church membership was not declining because of growing hostility to the Puritan faith or growing apathy. There was some of that, but that's not the big issue. The big issue was when that second and that third and that fourth generation thought about those stages of conversion and often asked themselves, do I think I have gone through these stages like I think my parents went through or my grandparents went through? Those amazing people that left England and came here and were just on fire for the Lord. Do I think I've experienced that same thing as them? No, I don't think I have. And they weren't happy about this. They were sad. They were disappointed. They were waiting for the Lord to put this conversion down upon them, to make it happen. But in comparison, they just didn't feel like they were worthy. Not compared to their parents, not compared to their grandparents. They knew what their parents and grandparents had gone through. I haven't gone through that. And so they didn't become a member of the church, not because they were hostile, not because they were apathetic, because they felt they were not worthy. And so when that first generation starts retiring from, say, the select board, when they start dying off, when they are no longer holding sway for the community, things started to slip. When that first generation was running the town, maybe you don't want to move out of the village because you don't want to disappoint them. You've got too much respect for them. But once they start retiring, once they start dying off, and now it's the second generation, third generation running, people you grew up with, people that you were born with here, you're not so worried about disappointing them. And so you decide to leave the village and move away. Nobody could replace the gravitas of that first generation. And when they started dying off and started retiring, things started to slip. When the first generation was running the town, more people were paying attention to the covenant. Once that first generation starts dying off, retiring, people stop focusing on the covenant in the same way. Things start to slip. First generation was important. One of the things about Puritan communalism was that we've talked a lot about the focus on group over individual. We've also talked about the suspicion of outsiders, people that are not part of the community. One of the signs of decline, Lockridge tells us, is when we start to see people in Denham turning to outsiders to solve problems. In the book, he talks about the case of a member of the town, a man by the name of Henry Phillips. Henry Phillips had a land dispute. We talked about this. Land disputes, because of the way in which the Puritans divided their lands up, land disputes were common. We talked about this. Henry Phillips had a land dispute. He went to the Board of Selectmen to get this resolved. And they voted against his wishes. So he was denied satisfaction by the Board of Selectmen. Normally, that would have been the end of it. But this time, Henry Phillips decides to bypass the Board of Selectmen and go to the General Court in Boston and try to get the General Court to resolve this. This is the first time anybody had tried to do that. Lockridge says this is a big deal. The people of Denham were a community. They were supposed to be one. Now, Boston was a Puritan city, and the General Court was made up of Puritans, but they weren't part of the town of Denham. And so, bypassing the town and going to the General Court in Boston was a way of a breakdown in communal ideal. This is not the way it was supposed to work. The closest analogy I might make for some of you that have had jobs, imagine you have a boss and you're having a dispute with your boss, and you go to your boss's boss to try and deal with this issue. How do you think your boss is going to like that? She or he is not going to like that very much at all. And that's how the people of Denham felt when Henry Phillips decided to go bypass this. So Lockridge talks about this as a sort of one of these growing signs of declining utopianism. People just aren't focusing like they were before on the needs of the community. Now, one of the reasons why Henry Phillips was bypassing the town and going to the General Court was because of growing individualism. One of the reasons why people of earlier generations in Denham would not have done this was for the harmony of the community. You know, people were upset when the select men voted against them. They weren't happy about it. But for the good of the community, they did their best to accept it and let things go that way. Henry Phillips was making an individualistic decision. I don't care about what the community wants. I want what's mine. I want what I deserve. And I will go to outsiders to get what I deserve, if that means going to the general court. And so one of the things that Lockridge says by the end of the 1600s, and particularly into the 1700s, there was a growing individualism where Puritans are starting to prioritize their needs over what's good for the community. Okay? We see this in terms of leaving the village and consolidating your land and going, living out on your land. People were increasingly doing what they want to do. We're going to talk about individualism a lot in our next unit. One of the principal characteristics of Benjamin Franklin was his individualism. And to this day, it's something we very much associate with American character, this idea of individualism. So it's not surprising this individualism is starting to grow. But for the Puritans, it was a sign of decline. To choose yourself over the community was a bad thing from the perspective of the Puritans. Okay. Well, Lockridge has a nice passage in page 88 and 89 in the book where he describes this decline. Okay, it wasn't the traditional kind of decline that historians would normally talk about. It was decline in this utopian vision. Right? And so he says, and it's on this slide, and I'm reading it for you here. There had been no dramatic social upheaval brought on by irresistible material forces, nor had a cathartic moral crisis replaced the old synthesis with a new. The village remained a small, slowly growing community with traditional views and unchanging institutions. It was just that the utopian aura was gone. Something almost intangible had happened then, and for almost inscrutable reasons. All right. Okay, everybody. We're done with the Puritans. We're on to the Enlightenment and Benjamin Franklin. I will see you for the next lecture.